My name is Adam Blackwell. I'm the Vice President, International Development Services Group. And on behalf of the team at the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, I'll be moderating this session, which is a continuation of a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism. The views expressed are those of the presenter. We're going to hear today about the language of far-right extremism in the United States. Dr. Ari Perlinger, who was going to join us, has unfortunately been called away to testify in a trial, so he will not be with us, but he has had a hand in all of this research. Dr. Perlinger is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and between 2010 to 16, he served as a faculty and director of terrorism studies at the United States Military Academy at West Point. And between 2016 and 2023 is the director of the graduate program in security studies at the School of Criminology and Justice at UMass Lowell. For more than 20 years, Dr. Perlinger has been extensively studying terrorism, political violence, security policy, and politics. His studies have appeared in multiple books and monographs and in numerous articles and book chapters. Have been cited in more than 2,000 academic texts. His recent book, American Zealots, Inside Right-Wing Domestic Terrorism, provides an in-depth analysis of history and contemporary trends of the violent American far right. Tess Hemmila, who fortunately has not been called to testify, is with us. She's a Ph.D. student in criminology at the University of UMass Lowell. She studies political violence and terrorism with particular interest in far-right extremism and religious extremism. Her research investigates online mobilization of far-right collective violence, far-right insider threats in law enforcement, and far-right online discourse and digital vigilantism after acts of political violence. Tess earned a master's at security studies at UMass Lowell and a BA at Dordt University. As an undergraduate, she was also an intern at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. As in previous sessions like this, Tess will speak for roughly 20 minutes. We'll have time for some Q&A. Please put your questions as we are proceeding in the Q&A function in Zoom. Tess, over to you.
Thank you very much. Just 1 second, please. I'll share my screen. Can you see my slides now?
We can.
Excellent. Okay. So hello, everyone. Very excited to be presenting for you today. Today's presentation is the language of far-right extremism in the United States. I'm going to be presenting our preliminary findings and walking you through our research on far-right discourse and how we can better understand the language and the patterns within these groups. So as we said, I'm Tess Hemmila. I'm a second-year PhD student studying security studies and terrorism. I've been doing this research with Dr. Ari Perlinger. He's unavailable today, but we work together at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Before we get too far, this research is funded by NIJ, but this presentation exclusively represents the views of the research team. So let's get right into it. So first, it's important to clarify when doing political research what we consider far right. So when we're talking about far right, generally there's two major criteria that we're looking for. We're looking for nationalism, which essentially means that they have a specific idea of what they think that the national and cultural identity should be, and nativism, which means that they will reject any influences that they view as contrary or a threat to the national identity that they want to promote. Included in that, there can also be xenophobia, racism, traditional conservative ethics, and anti-liberalism. These ideologies include a mix of these things, but they do have meaningful distinctions. So our research question for today, when we look at their discourse, is do far-right groups have distinct online discourse? And what we mean by that is, are there meaningful differences between these groups in the language that they use, in their social, in their political, and in their operational characteristics? We want to better understand the differences between these groups. In recent years, there has been the suggestion that far-right groups are becoming more similar, that their ideologies are merging. We've heard that especially after the Unite the Right rally. I believe that was in Charlottesville, and January 6th. These were scenarios where we were seeing far-right groups collaborating on a very large scale. So this raises the question, are these groups really that different? Are there patterns in their discourse that make them distinct? We also have an opportunity when we're analyzing this discourse to look into the association between their online discourse and their ideological and operational characteristics. Now, that's kind of a weird way to say it, but what we're getting at here is when we look at their discourse, what they say in private, does it actually match up with what they say and what they do in public? Does this match up with our understanding of these groups based on previous research, based on their previous behaviors, and based on their own descriptions of the group that they put into the public? So for this research, we took a sample of 6 different far-right groups. We believe these to be representative of the far-right landscape of the United States. So first we have neo-Nazi. This is a continuation of Nazi ideologies. This is quite popular in the United States. It includes basically white supremacy. So it incorporates aspects of racism and other forms of exclusionism. There's traditional racist groups. For this, you might want to picture the KKK. These are groups that are racist very broadly. This can include anti-Black, anti-Semitic, and anti-Islam rhetoric. There's anti-government groups. These groups view the US government as corrupted and essentially as a threat to its own citizens. They are concerned that the government poses a threat to them, and they are willing to fight back. The chauvinist far right. These are groups that incorporate kind of a broader ideology than most of the other groups. They celebrate Western culture, they celebrate conservatism broadly, and they fight very hard against the influence of liberalism and sometimes even just against moderate politics. In addition, they incorporate misogyny into their ideologies as a promotion of traditional values. And then there are the skinheads. The skinheads essentially are a blue collar or working class movement. They have created an identity as the working class and are willing to fight back against anything that they view as a threat to working class prosperity. And then finally, Christian identity. This group interprets Christian theology and the Bible to understand that the white race is the true Israelites of the Bible. As a result, they are very anti-Semitic and very anti-Black in their rhetoric. Okay, so the methods that we used for this research to answer our research questions, we wanted to collect discourse from these 6 groups off of social media and off of chat boards that we could get access to. So if you look to the right, you'll see each of the 6 ideologies, and there's a little bit more information about what groups and forums we were pulling from to represent these movements. And you'll also see the word count. That is the total word count of the text that we collected from these boards that we are analyzing. So with these massive chunks of text, some as much as 5 million words, we used a software called Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count to run these massive chunks of text and identify key differences and similarities using that software. But of course, no technology is perfect. No software can quite understand the nuances that we were looking for. So then we went back through and validated the findings to ensure accuracy. For example, the word Black can be used in many contexts, and it's important that we went through and clarified that we were getting correct hits for the concepts that we were looking for. And then we intend to test this research using statistical analysis to verify statistical significance in the differences, but we have not gotten to that phase yet. So today we will be going over the preliminary findings and we'll validate those later. So a little bit more about the software, just so you can fully understand what it's doing in this analysis. Linguistic Inquiry and Word Counter can quickly and accurately analyze very large bodies of text, sometimes seconds, sometimes minutes. We used 6 keyword dictionaries to identify political, social, and operational differences between far-right groups. Now, I'll go over these dictionaries in greater detail, but we essentially came up with concepts related to different political themes, different ideological themes to better understand the discourse of these groups. And then LIWC by default calculates metrics related to sentiment analysis. Now it calculates quite a few metrics automatically. It's a very robust software. But the ones that we found most interesting for sentiment analysis would be tone, emotions, and time orientation. So we will be going over those. So these are the 6 dictionaries that we used. So first you'll see adversaries. So these are outgroups, enemies, potential targets, basically anyone that they were describing as a target or an enemy we wanted to identify. Political and ideological dictionary contains many, many keywords related to different political issues, different ideological themes. And that will help us differentiate the issues that they like to talk about and prioritize. And then grievance contains different psychological and emotional aspects of grievance, as well as some operational characteristics. This helps us better understand if they're gearing up to something in their discourse, how they're expressing grievance, and how we can better understand how they gear up to violence, I suppose. And then operational. So these are indicators of preparation and operational capability. So this can include any violent language, any hint that they're planning something would be in the operational dictionary. And then socioeconomic status. This dictionary will help us identify the socioeconomic status, basic demographics, and characteristics of the group members to better understand how each group is composed. And then securitization. So these are indicators related to security efforts. This is more of a national security perspective on how things are going in the United States. So this can include different issues related to border security. This can include national disasters and other issues that threaten national security. So our hypotheses, we formed 7. So there's one for each dictionary and one for sentiment analysis. So the first 2 are quite similar. We hypothesize that they will identify and prioritize their adversaries and their political ideologies differently across groups. And then additionally, we hypothesize that they will express their grievances differently, that they will legitimize violence differently, that they will have different securitization language, that they will have different socioeconomic status and demographics in their membership, and that they will also use emotion and tone and time orientation differently. And we will test these hypotheses using our LIWC analysis. So first, we're going to go into the preliminary results, walking through each dictionary. So first, the adversaries dictionary. For this dictionary, we went through and verified that when they were using these concepts, they were not just throwing out the words, they were using them in a way that suggested some kind of anger, some kind of resentment, and some kind of, I guess, animus against these groups. So we went through and verified that for all of them. Now, first thing you'll notice is that the lists are very different across the groups. Some of them have issues that no other groups have, and they all have different rankings of each issue. You'll also notice that they have different counts. Some groups seem to focus on a much shorter list of adversaries than others. To understand how to read this graph, you'll see that under the name of the group is the list of total matches. Now, the numbers under that are a % of those matches. So we can better understand when they're talking about their enemies, who exactly are they talking about? So something to notice across these groups, as you might have expected based on how we started, is that their Jewish and Black adversarial categories show up in 5 out of 6 groups approximately, and that they rank quite high, especially the anti-Semitic language is quite high, nearly 10%, almost up to 50% in those 5 out of 6 groups. Now, this helps us better understand who each group prioritizes. And you can also see that there are some meaningful differences here. For example, tyranny, I believe, only occurs in 2 out of the 6 groups, but they have different rankings. This helps us better understand how these groups are prioritizing their enemies. So that is the adversaries dictionary. Now moving on to political and ideological dictionary. So you read this one much the same way. This is calculated as a % of the total matches for this dictionary. You'll notice that racist language appears in all groups to some extent and to different frequencies. Something that we find quite interesting here is that these groups are also incorporating anti-LGBT rhetoric and misogynist rhetoric in many of these groups. However, you'll notice once again that there are some issues that other groups take much more seriously or that some groups don't care about at all. For example, you'll notice that COVID appears in several of these groups, but it can go anywhere from one group has only 1% and one group has up to 18%. These groups are clearly prioritizing their political and ideological issues differently in their discourse. And then the grievance dictionary. This dictionary contains lots of psychological and social cues related to grievance holding. So some interesting findings here. Looking at the deadline category, you'll notice that traditional racist is the highest on deadline. Now, this can suggest a sense of urgency that they're building up to something. This would include keywords like soon or deadline or homework or planning. These are all words that we would use to understand deadline. And then also you'll notice that an interesting finding is that murder is very high for anti-government groups. This is explicitly violent language that we can use to better understand that these groups are working up to violence. And then you'll notice that violence is also very high for chauvinist far right. Now, violence and murder are separated a little bit. The violence keywords tend to be less explicit about death. It can be more general about wanting to hurt people. But the murder and the violence characteristics are slightly different, but very important to understand. As you can see, we have a lot of variables here that are harder to conceptualize, such as help or honor or jealousy. We're considering options to do structural equation modeling to better capture the latent concepts here of different emotions related to grievance. So then there's the operational dictionary. So this dictionary captures concepts related to war, tied to soldier or military experience rather, and also related to indicators and violence, basically working up to operational activities or behaviors. So some interesting findings here. It looks like chauvinist far right is the highest for indicators of violence. They're working up to something, they're preparing. These are similar words to the deadline characteristic in grievance. And also violence is very high, once again, for chauvinist far right. And moving on, security dictionary, you'll notice the anti-government is the highest. This is what we expected based on this group's ideology. They are predominantly concerned about the threats to the homeland and to American citizens. So this was expected. Looking at socioeconomic status, we need to dig into this further to really get nuance to it, but we can see that certain groups are prioritizing certain characteristics or talking more about certain characteristics of themselves. So for example, you'll notice that in traditional racist groups, group affiliation is quite high. Now, what that refers to in this context is potentially being members or associating with other far-right groups. That's interesting for us to understand if these groups are in contact or if they are competing against each other. In addition, you'll notice that race is high for chauvinist far right. Now, we aren't quite sure why that is. Technically, the chauvinist far right does not explicitly, I suppose, fall under white supremacy, although that could be an element. But that isn't what we would have expected to be their highest characteristic. We perhaps would have expected something more along the lines of nationality. Additionally, you'll notice that risk factors is the highest for anti-government. Now, risk factors can include financial issues, family issues, health issues, anything that makes individuals potentially more vulnerable to radicalization. So as we dig into that, as we dig into really all of these, we're hoping to better understand the characteristics of these groups and the composition of their membership. And then finally, these are the metrics that LIWC calculates automatically for tone, emotion, and time orientation that can better help us understand their rhetoric. So across the board, there seems to be more positive tone than negative tone, but interestingly, there seems to be more negative emotion than positive emotion. Now, that's quite an interesting finding by itself because these seem to be contradictory. However, this dictionary can automatically calculate the emotions using certain keywords. So these groups may be expressing different keywords, but they may be overall positive about their potential future. Across the board, you'll notice that there is more past and present focus than future focus. This makes sense with our understanding of the far right. They tend to be concerned either with their immediate issues or with traditional values. Seems to be quite a popular topic within the far right. So this is about what we would expect. But again, you'll notice that each group expresses themselves quite differently. You'll notice they're all different with emotions, with their time orientation, and with their tone. So now conclusions. Returning to each of our hypotheses, we can tentatively say that we have support for all 7 of these hypotheses. There are definitely notable differences in the key issues that each group talks about, in the way that they expect grievances, in the way that they legitimize violence, the way that they talk about securitization, the way that they talk about themselves, their socioeconomic status and demographics, and their use of sentiment analysis. Their use of sentiment. So we can definitely see that there are some differences here, but we are still pending statistical analysis to confirm that these are significant differences. So yes, once again, our findings suggest that there are meaningful distinctions, and this contradicts the popular belief that far-right ideologies are converging or merging. There seem to be notable and very important differences between these groups in their discourse, which we hope to confirm with our statistical analysis, which we are working on at the moment. And that is it from me. Thank you so much for having me. I am happy to answer any questions now. You'll notice my email and Twitter, also Ari's email and Twitter. Please feel free to reach out if you're not comfortable asking questions here or if you have different questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tess. Just to remind everybody, please put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom panel of Zoom. Tess, just refresh my memory. What's the timeline of this research? From when did it, the dates that you're
I'm not 100%. I would have to look at my data again, but I'm pretty sure it was approximately 2019 to 2022. I would have to look at it one more time. I'm sorry, I should have looked at that and put it on a slide, my mistake.
Okay. The first question, and again, please folks, put your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. The first question is, I wonder if your work includes any analysis of conspiracy theories and how these become violent. Oftentimes, many of the far-right groups use conspiracies to further their violent acts, and many conspiracy theories are rooted in anti-Semitism. So a lot on conspiracy theories there.
Yeah, we haven't dug into that specifically. That is an option that we're considering. I can tell you that conspiracy theories are very prevalent in this discourse. You certainly picked up on that. And yes, many of them do fall under, I suppose, the New World Order conspiracy, essentially anti-Semitic discourse. So yes, we could dig into that. It is a very interesting part of the discourse that we're noticing. Yes, thank you for your question. We will probably look into that at some point, but we're starting across the board looking at the differences between the groups, and then we can hone in on these very interesting characteristics.
Thank you, Tess. The next question, militias are often thought to be the most capable of violence of all of the far-right groups. Which other far-right groups seem to discuss violence the most?
I would say, based on our analysis, I would say Western chauvinists. In this discourse, that would be representative of the Proud Boys and similar groups, potentially like Patriot Front, similar groups. They seem to talk quite a lot about violence and have a very high desire for violence. There is always the question of whether whether talk becomes action, but they do seem to have very high desire for violence, propensity for violence based on their discourse. So yes, anti-government groups, yes, very high propensity for violence, but also I would say Western chauvinist groups.
Thank you. The next question, very interesting research. It became clear that they are not converging as common sense suggests. I wonder whether they have any issues with each other.
Yes, that is the theme that we've definitely noticed. These groups view themselves as very distinct, and they have very, I'm going to say, passionate disagreements with other groups on key issues. For example, in the Christian identity group, many of them will describe themselves as past white nationalists. So they have either left or been interested in white nationalist ideologies in the past, but they changed their minds and joined Christian identity groups because they didn't like that nationalist groups are secular. So they have very meaningful distinctions in their own minds, and they can be very hateful towards the other groups even.
Here's a question. What percentage of the attacks or incidents, I guess, of far right are conducted by lone attackers versus those conducted by individuals or members of groups?
That is not the topic of my current research, so I can't really answer that for you. I would say based on my knowledge of lone actors, there seems to be a very small pool of lone actor terrorists. There's a lot of debate, to my knowledge, about whether mass violence and lone actor terrorism should be studied together, because lone actors are very difficult to pinpoint ideologies for. Yeah, I can't really speak to that one. If you would like more information, please feel free to email me and I would be happy to look into it and get you a better answer. But off the top of my head, that's the most I can say. I'm not 100%.
Is we know you're looking at the differences between these groups and their speech. What are the greatest similarities that tie them together?
Yes. So they have a lot of similarities. If you noticed on the slides, I was pointing out that they have patterns of anti-Semitism, anti-Black rhetoric. I would say the racism thread generally pulls through across all the groups to varying degrees. And that is kind of what you would expect. We do define far right as nationalist and nativist, right? So it just depends what they consider the national identity to be. They will be extremely aggressive towards anything that they view as an outside influence or something that conflicts with that. But yes, I would say across the board, white supremacy and racism seem to appear to some extent in every group. I would say also anti-LGBTQ seems to appear quite a bit, and also misogynist rhetoric appears quite a bit. But again, varying degrees, each group views themselves as very distinct.
Here's a question I was going to ask you. Could you tell us the platforms used by far-right extremists you used in your analysis?
So these are all open forums. In some cases, they were Reddits. There are some boards that are by themselves standalone. So for example, Stormfront is a well-known neo-Nazi board. But for the most part, we were using public groups on Reddit channels, on different social media that we could find. But I would say generally chat rooms and Reddit. It's much easier to work with that data than to work with, for example, other social media might be more meme based, if that makes sense, a little bit harder to run through discourse analysis. So we were looking for ideally strings of text. So chat rooms were very good for that.
There's another question. Did you find any evidence of animosity between the groups?
Yes. Yeah, as I was saying, for example, skinheads hate being considered neo-Nazis. They passionately disagree with that, and they could not be more mad about anything than being considered a Nazi. For whatever reason, these groups view themselves as incredibly distinct, and they don't like it when other groups encroach on their territory. or make them look bad in that sense. So yes, there is a good bit of, I would say, animosity between them is a good word.
It comes to mind, and this is one of the reasons why I was asking about the date
Oh.
and Twitter that makes Twitter more prevalent to these groups or not. So how have you kind of mapped out kind of, catalytic events for some of these things, and whether some of the changes in some of the platforms like Twitter have made them more prevalent?
Okay, I'm sorry, you cut out a little bit. So just to clarify, what you're asking is if we accounted for different restrictions on language or deplatforming?
Grosso modo, yes. I mean,
Okay.
what about Twitter, and what about, changes of ownership in Twitter, changes of policy in Twitter?
Yeah, I really don't think we've used Twitter. Most of these groups seem to really hate popular social media. So most of the things that we use, to my knowledge, were Reddit forums or their own self-made forums or websites. So yeah, they are very anti censorship, as you can imagine. And they often will speak very negatively about popular social media or big tech, anything of that variety. So they generally gravitate to their own spaces where they think that they can speak freely.
Excellent. I don't see any more questions here for you, Tess. So sorry, one more. Which type of far-right groups do you believe present the most threat to Homeland Security?
That is a very difficult question. I think it's very hard to say based on this research alone. Once again, there is a disconnect between words and actions. So while these groups all use very concerning, very violent language, it's very hard to actually predict how much is talk and how much will be action. I would say, just based on the discourse alone, I was very surprised to see how I would say aggressive the language of the Western chauvinist groups can be. They are very willing and open to talk about violence and their desire to hurt people. So I would say, based on that, they have extremely violent language. I don't know which group has the most operational capabilities. That is very hard to parse out. But I would say Western chauvinists surprise me, but anti-government groups, we do know, have quite good capabilities. They have generally more operational experience with military or police than other groups. So it's very hard to pinpoint which is the most dangerous. I think they all have different capabilities.
We have a last question here. Have far-right groups shown interest in recreating an attack or an incident similar to that of January the 6th?
I would say I have not seen that in the discourse. I would say they were very disappointed with January 6th and very upset that it did not serve the goals that they wanted it to. I have not seen any discourse that makes me think that they want to repeat that. And once again, I was surprised by how passionately, I guess, conflicting they were with the other groups, how much they didn't want to be associated with each other. That was a bit of a surprise to me. It's easy, to look at these ideologies and just say, oh, well, they're all white supremacists, right? Like they should all want the same things. They don't think that way. They seem to think that there are very important differences between these groups. So I do not know if they will attempt anything like January 6th again.
Did you notice any link of any of these groups with any of the Islamists, like Islamic State?
No, I would have to say no, I haven't seen that in our data at all.
All right.
That's not to say it's not happening. It's just not available in our data.
Okay. Well, Tess, on behalf of the group, I'd like to thank you very much for a very interesting and enlightening presentation. I'm sorry that Dr. Perliger was not able to join, and I'm sure it was more fun being with us than testifying in court.
I think so.
please give him our warm regards, and thank you everybody who joined in today, and we look forward to the next one. Take care,
Thank you
everybody.
all. Thank you all for your time and attention. Again, if you have any questions that you didn't get answered here, feel free to shoot myself or Dr. Perliger an email, or follow us on Twitter, whatever you feel like. Again, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been great.
Thank you very much, Tess. Take care.